In the last section, we created our first model file, which represents a user in our database. I'm purposefully keeping a little bit of the discussion about this model and why we created it just a little bit light, because trust me, we are going to talk so much about models later on in this course, you're going to get tired of it really quickly. So now we've created this model, I want to write some code inside of my test directory to test this thing and make sure that we can actually insert a record into our database, see that it exists, and then just make sure that everything's working as we might expect a database to behave. To write this test, we are going to have to learn a little bit more about how Mocha works. So as I said earlier, if you don't know anything about Mocha or testing, no problem, we're going to cover it all from scratch. But if you do know what's going on, don't worry, we're not going to draw out the discussion too long. So let's get started. I'm going to keep this a little bit more to the point by first creating a new file inside of my test directory. I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to call this create test.js. So the purpose of this file right here is to write some test in here that is going to make sure that we can create a new user and save it to our database. That is the purpose of this file right here. Before we can actually write in some code that's going to test that that actually happens, we need to learn a little bit more about how Mocha expects us to structure our tests. This is a diagram of the type of structure that we're going to write for all of our tests when we start writing code with Mocha. At the very top level of every test file, we're going to have what we refer to as a describe block. Block is a little bit misleading term. It'd be better labeled as a describe function. So we are going to pass describe, or we're going to call a function called describe, and we're going to pass it a function. Inside of that function, we're going to have a variety of it blocks. It, like just it. It block, just like describe, would be better referred to as an it function. So we will call a function called it, and inside of this function, we'll put in a little bit of syntax or a little bit of code to test a very specific part of the code that we have inside of our user model. Both the describe function and the it function are provided to us automatically by Mocha. So we don't actually need to require any code in or anything like that. We can just start using describe and it inside of our test file, and everything is going to work automatically for us. I've taught a lot of people a lot about testing in the past. I found that kind of dwelling on test structure ends up being a little bit confusing, and usually it ends up being smoothest to just kind of get our hands dirty and write a test or two. So at this point, I think we'll flip back over to our test file and get started off by writing our first test and seeing how it goes. So I'm going to flip back over to my test file. And inside of here, I'm going to write out my top level describe function. So I'm going to call the function describe. The describe function takes two arguments. The first is a string that describes the test that we're about to write, and then the second is a function. Let's first do the string, and then we'll decide what to do with the function in just a second. I'm going to say this test is going to describe creating records. And as a second argument, I'm going to pass in a fat arrow function, like so. The purpose of this string right here is just to modify the testing feedback that we get from Mocha. It has absolutely nothing to do with how our tests are written, ran, anything like that. It is solely for the purposes of us figuring out what tests are breaking when we look at our test report to figure out what's going on. In general, I recommend using some reasonable names for these strings, just something where you could glance at it and say, oh yeah, okay, that's a test where they're doing something about creating records. That totally makes sense. Inside of the function that we pass as the second argument, we will place a variety of it blocks. And remember, it is a function just like describe is. So let's put down an it block. The it function takes these same arguments as describe. So the first argument will be a string, and then the second is a function. So for the first argument, I'll say it saves a user, and then I will pass in a function as the second argument. Cool. The it block is the absolute key to all testing inside of Mocha. Whenever Mocha sees an it function like this right here, it's going to say, the user or the developer is trying to run some type of test inside of this function right here. It will queue up all of the different it functions inside the entire test suite that we've written, and then it will run them all one at a time. Inside of every single it function that we make, we need to make what is called an assertion. An assertion is a piece of code where we say, I really hope that this value is equal to this value. The idea behind the assertion is to actually do the test, the actual part that says like, hey, is my code running appropriately? By default, Mocha does not include any tooling inside of here for automatically giving you the ability to make an assertion. And I say that because we automatically got access to describe an it, but the same is not true of making an assertion inside of the it function. Let's take a quick break and then come back in the next section and figure out how we make an assertion inside of our test file.